Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, shipmates. How are you today? Good? Good. Well, thank you for joining me, and I hope you had a good time in Colombia. And how many places have we been? Well, we're adding more every couple of days, and this kind of travel, I always call it like being a butterfly. You get to land here, to have a taste, go to the next place, and keep going. But it's hard to pick a favorite part of this part of the world because every place is interesting and or pleasant or familiar or unfamiliar. And I'm going to talk about two different places today because we're going to Jamaica tomorrow, and then after another sea day, we're in Cozumel, Mexico. And so by convenience, I'm talking about two things. So it could be two talks, but this is the schedule on board. It's such a busy schedule so that this is combined. I'll give you a momentary pause before I go to the next island. But first of all, Jamaica is famous in its own ways, particularly in music. We were listening to some of the reggae, and it's the anthem of the islands here. And they call Jamaica as this cultural fountain, particularly for music, and has influenced a lot of musicians around the world. But we've been near here. We're going actually due north from Cartagena, and Jamaica is conveniently located between Colombia and Cuba, and an island unto itself. It has a lush tropical environment, of course, and then many little islands around it, but it's not an archipelago. It's sort of one big island that has one large capital city here in Kingston. We have about 1 million people in this town. There's about 6 million in the whole island. So we'll be coming into one of the major docks there, and then we have our really only a half a day there. So you may get to the beach, you may get around up into the mountains. I think there's a coffee tour and different things, tour to the Bob Marley Museum. But the island itself has valleys and mountains. This is outside of Kingston where the hills start rising. Many different little towns. So if you've been there, you know that most people go to the beaches, and the interior is often not visited except going over. Maybe you can go hiking up. This is the Blue Mountains, which are these misty, forested mountains in the eastern side of the island. And so that's sort of a relief from long days at the beach. So it has a bit of a wilderness inside, not nearly as vast as, of course, where we have been in Colombia particularly. But you can go hiking up for a cool time in the forest and such. And so I found this picture of a red-billed streamer tail. If Todd McLeish is in the audience, tell me if that's the right name for it. But this is sort of a hummingbird with a big beak and a kind of a split tail, which makes it a very pretty unusual bird that's unique to Jamaica. Well, next to Kingston Town, there's Montego Bay, where a lot of the resorts are and the beautiful beaches that face south. So, of course, most people come here on a holiday and come to one little place or the other, and there are endless beaches all the way around and many private resorts and cabanas and all scale of things. So this is the major industry of Jamaica is tourism now. They also have coffee and production of musical production is actually one of their biggest industries also. But this is Doctors Bay near Montego Bay. This was famously called James Bond's beach because they shot some scenes of in a number of the James Bond movies in this area. And so people go there to swim and dive and snorkel and such. So this is very much what we're all here for, is a little break in the winter to come down and see the wildlife here. Hawksbill turtle and parrotfish. So if you don't need to go deep. The life is all around in the reefs. Well, this island, again, we came out of Cartagena. There's Jamaica, Cayman, Cuba, and all this. But this was before contact, let's say, with the Europeans. This was all Taino culture, from the Leeward Islands all the way up to the Bahamas. The Caribes came in from Venezuela and began to inhabit the Leeward Islands down here. These are the Windward Islands. But Jamaica was part of that general native culture, and they traded in canoes. They were a seafaring people that populated all these different islands, and with very large wooden dugout canoes, they would travel between and trade all the way from Mexico all the way through the different islands. So this is a pattern of historic migration. Professor Delanto described how it was maybe by water boats, small craft, that the first natives came from Asia to the Americas, and then within a fairly short order were all the way from Alaska all the way down to Patagonia and even out into the Caribbean islands, mainly because they were probably skillful sailors. And even Columbus, when he came, he was surprised by how many people were in so many places and how they could get around. Well, the Tainu are now mostly extinct, except that they still have a trace of their heritage in many island people, including Jamaica, the most being Puerto Rico. This is a reconstructed Tainu village where they've had archaeology, and they find ceremonial circles where they would have their whatever religion there is. Of course, this was unwritten and mostly suppressed by the Spanish, so it's not well known what they actually believed and did. There have been efforts to kind of recreate or reinvigorate some Tainu consciousness in some of the islands. But they lived on fishing. None of these islands had game other than small prey, but their staple was cassava, which is also known as yuca or manioc. That actually was an import from the Amazon, a wild tuber that, if you know it, you have to wash it because it has toxins in it until it's properly prepared and pounded. Now we have it served in the salt restaurant. There's yuca as an element in many of the dishes in this whole part of the world. It's a starch like a potato. And so these people had fairly simple diet and life, but on these islands, life was pretty easy and until things all changed. This was an archaeological find of a seat that they would build. There are very few archaeological remains because these people weren't nomadic, they just didn't build anything permanent like we saw in Peru and Colombia maybe. But here's a spoon from a dig in Jamaica, and also what they think was kind of a spirit stone. They call it a zeni in Tainu, which may have represented ancestors or may have been used in some rituals. So like a lot of archaeology, it's sort of when they find these things, they don't really know what they are unless there's some living account or some written account of which we don't have anything in the prehistoric Caribbean. But that one looks like some alien landed, maybe, with a big smile. I'm glad to see you. Who knows? But it all changed when this fellow stumbled on the islands. So Columbus came to Jamaica in 1494 on his second voyage. And later on his fourth voyage, he got shipwrecked in Jamaica and had to live off of the land with the Tainu people helping him for a year before he went back to Hispaniola and back to Spain. This is a curious statue because he seems to be growing a garden on his head, I found. Now this is in Kingston town. And then as a sailor, I have my interest in study of Columbus, the world's greatest sailor, and of dubious results sometimes. But in Cartagena, I took the picture of he and his native secretary. I think that was her official title there. Of course, a lot of these Columbus statues have been taken down or defaced in the redress of history, because what happened, of course, was the Spanish wanted gold, they wanted conquest. If there was any resistance, they'd send the dogs on them and charge them with the horses. This is how Pizarro conquered Peru and Cortez conquered Mexico, just by the force of arms and having superior war-like activity, including dogs. That was something that particularly terrified these big, massif Spanish war dogs, they used to call them. And so the Tainu people in the Caribe also were either driven into slavery or they died of smallpox, cholera, different diseases that the Europeans brought. And in exchange, the natives gave to Europe syphilis as a fair trade. But the last of the full-blooded Taino had died out a long time ago. This was a picture taken about 1900 of the last village of Taino in Jamaica. And then, since then, they've pretty much melded into the mix that is Jamaica, including African, Chinese, Lebanese, all kinds of people have settled in Jamaica over the centuries now. Well, it originally was held by the Spanish until the Admiral William Penn, under Oliver Cromwell, decided that Jamaica would be an easy target to take an island away from the Spanish rule, which they did. They came and invaded. They had battles around, naval battles around Jamaica, and then a governor was installed in the name of Henry Morgan, who had been a privateer, pirate, basically, that he was then in charge of running this new British territory of Jamaica and then continuing the attacks on the Spanish Main for all the gold and whatever they might be able to take. And at that time, there was an alliance with the other French privateers. They were official pirates. They were not allowed to prey on anybody, only on the recognized enemy. So this Francois Lolonois was particularly famous because he teamed up with Morgan and the other bunch, and then he would attack the Spanish, and he was famous for tearing the hearts out of Spanish sailors. Oh, well. But this whole period is full of drama and cruelty and torture and such. But all these islands became the home of what they call the buccaneers, which were either the castaway sailors, the refugees, the assorted fugitives that would come, and they'd live on an island, and they learned from the Taino people how to catch game. But what the Spanish had done, they had let domesticated pigs on the islands. They go feral and become wild boars, we would call them now. And then they would hunt them, and then they would dry the meat. And they'd put them on a fire and spit them up, and then they would sell it to the ships, because the people didn't know how to fish very well back then, particularly sailors. And so what they call boucan, which was dried meat in French, became what the diet and the trade item between the pirates. And then we get the word buccaneers from that. And we also get a dining tradition known as barbecue, which in some versions have said in French, the barbecue means de la barbe à la queue, meaning you eat the whole animal from the beard to the tail. So that's our pirate meal that we enjoy these days. But they were a rough, if not always ready, lot, and they would capture other nationalities, impress them into service. Here's a fellow being captured and say, you either join us or you lose your hand. But I mentioned this, that this sort of wild bunch of sailors, pirates, developed their own culture where they would elect their leader, and they would also share all gains and booty equally, but some got a little bit more. The navigator, the cook, the surgeon that would help people. And so this led to that period of the golden age of piracy, which was about 1650 to 1740, when the Treaty of Reswick in Europe banned all privateers and pirates, and the navies of the time joined to try to suppress it. But for a brief and golden period, they had what they call libertalia, which means they would steal whatever they could from the Spanish, and they had their own little pirate lair, first in Tortuga, an island north of Haiti, and then in Port Royal, Jamaica. That was the bigger one that developed. And so they would come after they'd had their adventures at sea, and they would have wine, women, and song, and then save a little bit for their pension, maybe even pay a few taxes. I don't think so, though. And so this has been described in a Dutch book called Esquilier, who described this flagrant life of the privateers and pirates in this area. Then they set up in Port Royal. This is the bay into Kingston. The town is right there now. But this peninsula became fortified and easily defended, had a very snug harbor for the ships right there. And this became the notorious pirate capital of the Caribbean. And Henry Morgan was the appointed governor of it. And so this is the stuff of Pirates of the Caribbean. If you've seen the Disney classic with Johnny Depp walking off his sinking ship onto a dock, that's right here in Port Royal. From there, they attacked the Spanish in Cartagena, Maracaibo, then Panama. Particularly, they made a very large fleet that went to Panama, and this was a point when the pirates were sort of an unofficial navy. They had full rig ships, they had gunners and Marines, and so they would fight and take over more ships. And then Henry Morgan marched on Panama in 1671 with thousands of soldiers and horses and such, and he stampeded cattle that he rounded up to get to Panama City, where the gold from Peru was kept. And he was your typical merciful, merciless pirate. They came and they sacked the old city of Panama, which remains as a ruin. I don't know if you went there on a tour, but the Spanish kept that as a memento of that terrible time. They built a new fortified city in what's now downtown Panama. And Henry Morgan, of course, is remembered drop by drop ever since then. And his motto, of course, is lives on in many a sail ship. The beatings will continue until morale improves. Well, we know that kind of management. It's usually effective for a little while. Until what happened was a great earthquake in 1692 collapsed most of the fort and this town right into the sea and killed some 2,000 people. So this was sort of the revenge of propriety to demolish the pirate capital. Parts of it still remain. The Port Royal fort batteries are still there. Some of them survived better than others. But this is something you just go on a trip from the main town out on the peninsula and see the remains of the old Port Royal fortifications. This was the old hospital building, which is now in ruins. It's all been pretty much abandoned because it's on very unstable ground, and some of the buildings are still wondering how long they're going to last. But otherwise, Jamaica became settled with the planters, the plantations. When they ran out of any natives that might be enslaved, they brought in indentured servants, including many Irish. Most of the population of Jamaica that was not African was actually Irish. And so they laid out land and they brought in slaves and then began the commercial economy of sugar, which at the time was so valuable that it was like they called it the white gold of the Americas. And of course, that's what was part of the triangular trade from sugar to the North America or to Europe, and then textiles and other goods down to Africa to trade for slaves, and then slaves over to the Americas to make more sugar. And so this was a long period of a few centuries and is mostly gone because, of course, sugar is now a commodity that's very inexpensive because there are many different ways to make it other than sugar cane. But this led to the cruelties of the plantations and then many uprisings. So 1833 was a very large one which burnt down many of the plantations and had fighting, and finally the Royal Navy and the Marines had to come in to suppress it. But what was interesting is that enough of the African slaves escaped and were armed that they made their own regiments, and they fought very effectively to the point where what they call the Maroons, or the Cimarrones in Spanish, were such an effective fighting force that they, in 2 wars, they claimed the independence of the upland areas where they had taken refuge. Curiously, this was an Englishman who joined with the Africans in the resistance and developed a certain form of guerrilla warfare against the redcoats down in the lowlands. And so these, what they call the Maroon towns, there's a dozen or more in the Blue Mountains in western Jamaica, were functionally independent from Kingston and the British rule. And to this day, they still elect their own leaders. Here's the current leader of one of the towns, Farron Williams. So this made the Jamaicans pretty proud. It was the only place other than Haiti where Africans rebelled and got their independence such as it was. And so this has led something to the Jamaican spirit of independence and pride and music and all these sort of things. They started reviving some of the African traditions of festivals and Yoruba worship, voodoo, and all these things came back to life when there was permission. And the The British Parliament actually enacted, first of all, the abolition of the slave trade. Then it required Sundays off, and then they allowed teaching of reading and writing. So this began to educate and then help the people of Jamaica to develop to a modern nation. They also built a much bigger city. Out of Port Royal, it became a grid city of Kingston, which remains there today, with a lot of classic colonial buildings. The problem is the earthquake that ruined Port Royal also came back to ruin Kingston town. So there was a multiple number of earthquakes, fires. So the town has been rebuilt over and over again. They haven't had a major problem lately, but it's just on an unstable piece of land. So in Jamaica, they have such a tragedy and also calling. This became the most famous of the Jamaicans in the later 1900s because he proclaimed a movement to go back to Africa and establish African countries with the knowledge that they acquired in the Americas. And so he became sort of a self-appointed king of the return to Africa, and the country of Liberia was founded in this movement. He himself didn't rule it itself, but this is an example of the black nationalist consciousness came out of Jamaica as much as it did all the other colonies and countries. 1962, Jamaica was granted its independence from the UK, though it's in the Commonwealth and it has a constitutional monarchy. So the head of state is actually Charles III now. But the Jamaicans are very proud that they have made a fairly prosperous country out of, as they say, out of many. I mean, the majority are of African descent, but you have many other communities, including the long-term Prime Minister, Michael Manley. He was both of Irish, Portuguese origin, but he was born and raised in Jamaica, and then he led, say, a moderate government versus the neighbors to the north in Cuba or the trouble in Nicaragua. All the neighborhood had trouble, but Jamaica has had some trouble, but it's been fairly peaceful and fairly prosperous. And part of it's just the activity of the people and the lushness of the land, and then people coming and visiting especially. It became sort of a hot tourist destination in the 1960s. But I'll just show you just some of the people, and there's a great deal of style and pride in Jamaica. And it often comes down to, as usual, sports. So they are champions at cricket, and they have a polo team. And most famous, they have this Usain Bolt, who was the Olympic sprinter runner. So he's sort of the current national hero. And but this will to sports got to a point of, let's say, curiosity when the Jamaican bobsled team went to the Winter Olympics. So how do you practice bobsledding in the tropics? Well, they managed to compete. But mainly it's a beautiful island with beaches around and lots of small towns and things on the shore and friendly people. I mean, Kingston has a reputation of being dangerous in the backwoods of it, but I've never heard of anybody having any real trouble. It's generally a very friendly place like we find in most Caribbean places, with cuisine, local fish. Famously, they have goat stew, jerk chicken, all these sort of dishes that you probably get a taste of in Salt again. And then there's all of the different little tuck-away resorts. So I'll just show you a few of them in their own little bay. And here's a little private island. So this becomes, let's say, luxury priced resort destinations. And of course, it's attracted many celebrities. Well, you may know some of these, Noel Coward and a young Jack Kennedy, and a young Queen Elizabeth. And she got her own royal yacht there. And then a few other mysterious movie stars, including Anne Margaret. But famously, Ian Fleming had a house there near Montego Bay, and he wrote most of the Bond stories there. And so that's why they went to shoot some of the Bond movies in the streams and in the jungle. And so this is sort of the recent heritage of Jamaica. And they even let this guy in, Daniel Craig, because he needed to practice his fishing skills. So there's a lot of little places to go, and we just don't have enough time to get around the island much, but you can always come back and book a bungalow. This one's on the shore and with underwater caves near it. But it is a place for getting away from it all, golf, etc., and having a swinging time like that, or it's a marital balance act. That's what it is. There we go. But we can always come back and taste more of it. I'm just showing you things that are possible there. But again, it's mostly about the sea. We don't go there for mountaineering as much as to have a look over it and perhaps even jump in. But the Jamaicans are very proud, and of course it's been called the tiny island with a superpower of culture, because there are more people of Jamaican descent living in the UK and North America than there are in Jamaica itself. But still they go back, and particularly the local people are always playing music, and these days they have a great deal of fashion. So here's maybe that's in the market, a gourd hat, like a hard hat. Others are more elaborate. And so this is a lot of what they call black fashion, is very exuberant, I'd call it. This guy has the hottest pants I've ever seen. But the other side of it is the Rastafarians. Now you may have heard that term, the Rastas, which are coming out of the maroon mountain independent villages where they believe that they have to go back to Africa. They have to clean their spirit, and particularly they don't allow any alcohol or eat any meat. And this was sort of a spiritual hermitage for Jamaica, but now it's turned into a pretty large fashion statement. They think that Haile Selassie is the Messiah, the former emperor of Ethiopia. So they have an active and recognized religion, sort of like voodoo in Haiti. But a lot of it is, I had one friend said, oh, they're just, all these dreadlock guys, they're not really religious. They're just ready to have fun. So that's the Lion of Judah, a symbol of Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. The other thing is that they famously started growing marijuana, and so they typically would have a big spliff, or a Jamaican baseball bat, they call it, roll up a big wad of marijuana, and they would smoke it all day long, which then sort of has its effect on your mind, I guess. And then they have the long dreadlocks, which is characteristic, and now it's spread around the world. Even all kinds of people get that. Here's probably the champion dreadlock, this guy, all the way down to here. Though you got to watch your step, though. They say, what would happen if there was no more shampoo in Jamaica? It would be dreadful. But it's you can get it done on the beach, and it's kind of a big industry. A lot of it's synthetic, but it's. I myself, I can't imagine having that much hair while you have a hot climate. But then we're used to what we know. So sometimes it gets pretty creative, and then there's the music. So from the different African traditions mixed with the Tainu rhythms and things like this. A lot of Caribbean music is actually completely a mix of native indigenous rhythms with African, with European harmonies and instruments and all that. So Jamaica has always been a fountain of music for these reasons, just like particularly Puerto Rico. And even Harry Belafonte, who just passed away, he was born in Trinidad, but he lived in Jamaica before he went to the U.S. and became an international star. But the most famous, of course, is Bob Marley, who began the reggae movement. And he had this characteristic two-beat, which is, I call it the pacemaker of youth, because it's and his band, the Wailers, became the best-selling pop music from about 1970s. And that band itself was one of the major economic incomes for the whole country. And so it spawned 1,000 other bands. That would, for your musical instrument, this is the actual beat. You can hear it. We were playing it before. And then it got very elaborate with big band settings. This is Jimmy Cliff, also a best-selling singer. And so you may remember from a few decades ago, reggae was everywhere. And one musicologist said, anywhere on the earth at any minute of the day, there's reggae playing somewhere. Makes Beethoven roll over, of course. And even wannabes like Mick Jagger came here to join the band. But all over, every little town, every little block has a band, because that's the way to make it in Jamaica. So here you go. In a house, on a rock, in a bay, reef on an island, in Jamaica, man. And at night, the stars come out and the phosphorescence is in the water. I have a joke. A Rasta brought a big bag of marijuana to a bank, and the cashier said, why are you bringing this into the bank? He said, I want to open a joint account, man. Well, the national motto I read here, we speak English, we dress American, we kiss French, we eat Italian, but we smoke Jamaican, man, etc., etc. Well, I'm going to move on to Cozumel, which is this island right here off the great Yucatan Peninsula. Sometimes our ships come over to Royatán, Belize, but Cozumel is the reef-surrounded island just off of this site, Tulum. This was an ancient Mayan temple, which is a site over the sea facing Cozumel, but it's near, if you've been there, Cancun, the big development out on the spit of land that has been there for about 30 years. Before it was just a spit, and it may return to that because even after all of this fantastic development, the problem is the hurricanes keep coming in and washing away the beach. I was once at one of these hotels, and now the water pounds at the pavement even. And the other problem they've had is sargassum. This is all seaweed that has come in and covered what's left of it. So this kind of castles in the sand may not live for very long. But meanwhile, the island is quite beautiful. It's very flat. We'll be landing on its west shore, and then there are excursions out to all these different beaches. That's the Mayan site of San Gervasio. But again, we're there a day, and we'll be informed arrival. The biggest problem at Cozumel is all the monster ships come from Houston, Galveston now, Florida, and around the world to come park at the pier on the west side near the little strip of the town here, except that sometimes there's just so many of them that you have to wait for a parking place. And so this is what could be said about it. He says it's not an invasion, it's a cruise. So get ready for a bit of a crowd, particularly this week. But anyway, we land on one of the 2 or 3 different piers, and you just walk in. There's a strip of all kinds of shops and hotels and restaurants along this side. But it's not a big port like Cartagena. It's just the access into the inland and to the beaches. But you can walk around. It's sort of a busy place, I'd call it, and but friendly. But I do not recommend taking a tequila tour if you expect to get back to the ship. But you can go stay at all these different beaches, and the whole island's just surrounded by them. So this is the attraction of Cozumel. You're in Mexico, but you're apart from the rest of it, particularly central Mexico, and so a lot of Mexicans come here to vacation. Sort of like in Cartagena, most of those big condos were of other Colombians who come here for their holidays. But you can either snorkel right off the beach or you can go scuba diving. But the problem is a lot of the areas have become overdeveloped, and so these last beaches have been made reserves, so they don't have too many people. But because it's so shallow, you can go swimming. You don't need any equipment other than a snorkel and fins. You can go out and see plenty of fish life and such. Or you can take a ride on one of these. So this is where tourism gets almost ridiculous or more fun than ever, especially if you take these new diving helmets so you can just walk around on the the seabed and look around at it. And there's your coral reef and lots of life there. But the people who live in the island of Cozumel have been protesting plans to build ever bigger mega resorts there, as they don't want to see particularly the coral life damaged by too many more people. They've been trying to clean it up, but they have an extensive restoration program in different parts that have been impacted by either the warming of the waters or runoff from agriculture or sewage. So here's a little farm that's growing leghorn coral. So they'll take pieces that were bleached or had no living coral, they'll plant polyps on it and they'll start to grow, and then they'll plant them out and extend and can grow the reef again. So this has been shown to be effective. Of course, the problem is coral around the world is being decimated and you can only fix a little bit of it at a time, but they have a research center here in Cozumel where they design structures, like kind of a big framework, and then they can put different species of coral and they'll grow into a full bloom as long as they don't get overheated or stressed or interfered with. So here's a soft coral that is growing on one of these meshes. Here's a brain coral where they're trying to, again, start another growth on it. But coral it's an animal with an algae in it that then is a symbiotic animal. And if it's too hot or the water temperature or the salinity changes, they can't live, and so they fade out and they may be replaced by other ones. But curiously, they're using electricity on these structures because a low voltage electrical current seems to stimulate the growth of fresh or new polyps of coral. And so in Cozumel, they made it a competition in the schools to design coral housing. So they did mesh framing, and then they provided an electrical charge to that structure, and that then gets covered with coral much quicker. So this is where, humans have caused a problem, but maybe we can engineer and figure out a way to return the sea to a more natural state. If you go on the land tour to the interior, there's no great jungle or mountain or anything. It's pretty flat and scrubby palm and lowland tropics, but they do have cacao plantations, and where they, since antiquity with the Mayan people, they will make chocolate. And the process of grow a bean, they take out the kernel, they roast it, and then they produce chocolate, and then nowadays add milk and sugar to it. It was originally a drink that was taken in its raw state, and it's kind of bitter, almost like a syrupy coffee. But the Mayans had actually a cacao god, along with their corn god. And so this was a staple of Cozumel, as in all of the rest of Yucatan and other parts of Mexico. But the Maya people are still there, even if the classical culture collapsed before the Europeans came. But those people are in about 5 or 6 million between Yucatan, Campeche, and which Quintana Roo, which Cozumel is part of. But you'll see the traditional mud adobe house with a mud floor, thatched roof. They're still around in Cozumel and in the countryside of Yucatan. And these people are, let's say, a model of survival in the midst of all kinds of troubles. The classical period, they had large temples and armies and cities, and they keep finding more of the extent of the Mayan culture all the way down Guatemala up through Yucatan. But the people are known for their weaving and their other skills, pottery, things like this. And they're still active, even though they're incorporated into the Mexican culture. But you don't really see much of the communities in Cozumel because the population is low on the island itself. But just over into the mainland, you see them still weaving as they've done for 1,000 or more years, as illustrated in this pottery version of called backstrap loom. They also have courtyards where they used to pay pocatok, where you would kick a ball around a rubber ball and then try to get it through that little hole. And this is a classical temple ground would always have a ball field for competitions. Here again is another Mayan ceramic with the rubber ball. Of course, we now think, well, where did we have rubber balls? It's originally an Amazon invention. It came from the indigenous people of the Amazon up to the Maya, and then it ended up in the football stadiums. So it's still played. Here's an example of sort of ceremonial playing of it with music. And here's some kids playing a version of it where you can't use your hands or your feet. You have to use your body to knock the ball around. So it's even more difficult than other sports. And then there are other Mayan traditions that we've inherited. First of all, tobacco. Here's a mural of a guy smoking. I think it's tobacco. I'd have to ask him, though. And then they also had chicha, which is corn beer. So this guy looks like he's already had one too many. And then they had animated rituals. We don't know quite what it sounded like. They've recreated some. These are rain sticks that are bamboo with pebbles in them. It makes the sound of rain, conchas and horns and different things. And so I don't have the recording of it. Here's a Mayan harp, which is a traditional instrument there, pre-European. And they keep finding more, not so much in Cozumel, but the other sites around Yucatan. There's so many. It's like Professor Delanto said, they were only scratching the surface of the past because there are many more sites that are found mainly through salvage construction, let's say. But these are the kind of ceramics that are found these days in different parts of nearby and Yucatan. And again, we don't have a clue to some of them. We know they're either historic figures or deities. I think this was the god of the buffet. But in Cozumel, there is this one major site called San Gervasio, which has these incredibly well-preserved rises. They probably had a big thatched roof that either decayed and it was abandoned, or else a hurricane came and blew the whole roof off. I don't know, but it was a temple that was to the goddess of fertility. And on a tour, you can go see this, though she is called Ixchel, and she was the fertility goddess and also considered the midwife for new birth. And so maybe you've been to other parts of Yucatan in the Mayan world, Palenque and Chichen Itza and things. There's fantastic temples. And so some of them are very difficult to get to. So the Mexican government is now building a train, high-speed train from Cancun near there all the way to central Mexico. And to the objection of many of the local Mayan people, they don't want more tourists, and they don't want to upset their ancestors and have too many crowds at places like this. This is Chichen Itza, the main cenote, the well of fresh water that's just below the limestone surface. And so this has been quite a fantastic discovery that they had these very deep aquifer that's under the entire Yucatan, even under Cozumel, there's fresh water under the ground. And it's all connected, so there's almost a freshwater lake under the whole region that dates from geological forces, the uplifting of the sea, of the land and things. But one thing people go diving in the cenote now. But they were considered sacred places where they would sacrifice people or else put valuable things as offerings down there. And then, if you've ever been to Caracol, this is another site which has an astronomical tower for measuring eclipses, stars, and to make the great Mayan calendar. So they think that the chief astronomer and priests would go up there to make sightings and sacrifices. And then they found that the lines into the inner chamber are perfectly aligned for the winter solstice. You can judge the rise of Venus and many things off of just the architecture. And this is described in the Mayan glyph language, which has been decoded. And they describe a calendar system that's in 20s and 5s, and then they had a written numerical system, a system of the months of the year, and then the year, and then they calculated a calendar that would go on for thousands of years, if not for eternity. But it goes through a cycle, and so it was quite astonishing that the Maya had more advanced astronomical calculations and mathematics than anybody at the time, except maybe Egypt. We don't know. It's hard to compare, but here's what could happen. No, 30 days past September. The Aztecs had the same sort of calendar system. And a lot of this has been studied and sort of revived the pride of the Maya. And they're allowing shamans and worship of the old deities and things like that back in the temples, which was completely banned under especially the Catholic Inquisition. But there's a whole revival of the Mayan sense of pride like we've seen in other parts of the Americas. Well, I'll leave you at Tulum here. And a Mayan proverb says, "It is not good to hide anything from your parents because they may change." And do not gaze at the clouds too much or you'll never get your work done. And so this has a unique cultural history, this area, but mainly it's just the beauty of it and the sense of being in a special place, even if it's a bit commercial in Cozumel. But I'll leave you another writer who wrote a book called House of the Jaguar to try to express some of the Mayan philosophy. And he says, we have two minds. One thinks and one knows. The mind that knows goes back many lifetimes. This is the mind of one heart, of all things, the trees, the clouds, the rivers, the mountains. The more time you spend with this mind, the more you see spirit all around you. And I hope you have a good visit to Cozumel and Jamaica. Have a good day, man. Thank you very much. Thank you.